Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this month's Acting for Justice event. My name is Jack Jezreel, and I serve on the staff of Just Faith Ministries. I'm joined, as always, by my colleague, Leela Oakley, and we're both delighted you could join us tonight. Let's begin, as we always do, with prayer. Probably, like most of you, one of the matters that troubles my mind and heart these days is war, Gaza, Ukraine, Congo, many, many other places. So let us begin tonight with a prayer for peace. Spirit of the living God, come afresh on your holy land. Help your people to restore the broken relationships. Give us, all your people, patience to break down barriers of suspicion and mistrust, the ability to discern personal prejudices, and the courage to overcome fear. Teach us all to respect each other's integrity and rights, so that your kingdom, your way, may be established on earth. For the sake of us all, for goodness' sake, for God's sake. Amen. And now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Johnny Hill serves as senior pastor of the historic Gethsemane Missionary Baptist Church in Bunn, North Carolina. He's also the director of corporate and foundation engagement at North Carolina Central University. Dr. Hill teaches courses at Duke University Divinity School as a visiting faculty member, and at Hood Theological Seminary as the Leon W. Watts II visiting scholar in Black theology and the Black church. Dr. Hill has published 4 books and has preached and lectured across the nation and the world. And Dr. Hill, we're delighted you could join us tonight. It's all yours.
Well, thank you so very much, Jack, for that wonderful introduction, and to, of course, Susie and to Lila and to the entire Just Faith community. Thank you so very much for this gracious invitation and an opportunity to share with all of you tonight. I really am so grateful to God for your presence here with us, for taking time out to be a part of this wonderful conversation and this discussion this evening, and for allowing me to come into your community, into your home, into your space on this lovely evening to have a conversation. And truly tonight, that is the nature of this discussion, is really to have a dialogue and a conversation about something that was started over a generation ago. And that was an idea, a vision, a concept that was born in the heart, mind, and spirit and soul of a man by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. Some of you who are on the call tonight may have walked with Dr. King on the streets of Chicago, on the streets of Louisville, Kentucky, perhaps in Memphis, Tennessee, or in Birmingham, Alabama, or across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. It was a dream and a vision called the World House and the beloved community. And so tonight, I want to share a few remarks about the World House and what it means to build communities of justice and reconciliation for the present context. I want to share about what it means in local communities, how we can advance that great legacy of the World House in both small and big ways, and how we can lead a legacy in our own journey in a way that others can follow long after we're gone. Before I begin, I want to share with you a short story, if you allow me, just to share with you a short story about a young boy growing up on the edge of an old plantation in the belly of the South. I was born in a little town in Southeast Georgia called Vidalia. And if there's anybody on the call tonight that likes to cook, you may have heard of the sweet Vidalia onions. Well, I grew up right outside of Vidalia. I see a few folks shaking their head. You know, those onions are really, really great. So I grew up on the edge of a small plantation, the edge of an old plantation in the belly of the South, right outside of Vidalia, Georgia, called McGregor, Georgia. I come from 3 or 4 generations of sharecroppers and veterans. And so after I finished high school, I did what my grandfather and my uncles all did, and that is go and serve in the military. So I served in the U.S. Army. And my first encounter, friends, with the global world came when I walked the streets of South Korea as a 19-year-old soldier in the Army. It was my first experience with a world outside of Vidalia, Georgia, a world that even extended beyond the U.S. borders. And then as a graduate student, I had the privilege of visiting Kenya as well as Haiti. I had the privilege over my journey of nearly 2 decades of teaching in theological education and serving in administration, and of course, serving in the context of parish ministry as a pastor. And what I've learned is that all around the world, we are essentially the same, that from whatever walks of life we come from, regardless of our race or gender or ethnicity or cultural background, we all strive for the same vision in the world. And so Dr. King's vision of the World House is a way of helping us to think about what's possible, not just in the future, but in our present time, for how we can learn how to live in communities of justice and peace together. I believe tonight, friends, that the world is crying out for an awakening, that now more than ever before, there is an urgent need for a moral awakening in America and around the world. The growing crisis that we're seeing across Europe and of course across this nation as it relates to fascism or white supremacy or white nationalism, or even the problems of the growing wealth gap between rich and poor, all point to an urgent need for change and evolution and growth in our world. There is no challenge, I believe, greater in our world than to heal the land. And of course, we've heard that before. Many of us that are on this call tonight have been hearing stories about the need to heal the land, to change the world, to make a difference in one way or another. And I would argue that on the one hand, we've always faced these challenges throughout history, but the world is more broken and divided than ever before. The fragmentation we're seeing now is not limited to far off, distant lands. It has visited our homes, communities, and certainly in our nation as well. Bursting open on our midst through it all, even in the midst of all of this brokenness and all of this fragmentation, in the midst of it all, there is burgeoning in our midst a growing vision and longing for change, for peace, for reconciliation, for hope, for communities of justice and peace together. With prophetic rage, I believe we can find a way through it all, friends. If we have the courage to dream together and to hope together, we might be able to find, like William Blake, the ability to see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower, to hold infinity in the palm of our hands and eternity in an hour. In this presentation, for just a few moments, I hope to accomplish a few things. First is to make the dramatic case for the need for a moral and spiritual awakening for the present age. Secondly, I hope to show that now is the time. Yes, there's always been times for this, but now more than ever before, there's an urgent need for the church and for people of faith to come together, to raise awareness and to move with urgent courage for the cause of justice, human dignity, community, and sacrifice if necessary. And thirdly, I'd like to talk about the need to confront the escalating culture of violence and hate, as is evidenced in the mass shootings we've seen over recent years, as well as the violence we're seeing in other parts of the world, of course, in the Ukraine, in Palestine, in Israel, of course, and also in the Congo and Sudan and other parts of the world as well. I also hope to talk about the need to point the way forward. So not to get just mired in the problem or in the issues or the concerns, but how do we move forward? How do we find concrete, specific strategies for moving toward communities of peace and justice for the present time? And then finally, to offer constructive strategies for awakening local communities to work toward justice and peace for the present age. You know, the world is changing like never before, friends. I know many of you are looking at the television and probably are aware of the shifts that's taking place with social media and with transcontinental travel and all of the technological advances related to AI, that the world is changing rapidly now more than ever before. I mean, friends out there on the call tonight, am I the only one that's literally like losing my mind with all of the changes that are happening in the world so quickly? I mean, so frequently. The changes as it relates to AI, to online virtual engagements with reality, the television shows, the massive amounts of content that's being uploaded every day on the internet. It's just amazing to see all of the changes that's happening in our midst. So I don't know about you, friends, but I'm just really freaking out and looking at all the changes that's happening in our world today. So you can't deny the fact that the world is changing. The dramatic advances in technology and science, mass digital communication, and transcontinental travel, as well as globalization, has made of our world a deeper awareness of our differences. Now, I want you to hear me well with this. So the world has always been filled with differences. We've always had people from different walks of life, different races, ethnicities, cultures, languages, and backgrounds. But the way in which technology has now come into our lives has sort of sensitized us and made us much more aware of the differences and the cultural anxieties that come with reconciling those differences with our own unique stories and narratives. So here we are, friends. On the one hand, we're becoming more and more immersed in a world of differences through technology, through the ability to travel the world in the blink of an eye. I could catch a flight tonight and wake up in China or Asia or anywhere in Latin America or Africa tomorrow morning. So the world is changing so rapidly, and yet the awareness of our own unique stories and narratives in conversation with those changes, it leads to a sense of anxiety, sometimes fear, sometimes frustration, and the need to sometimes resort with a sense of protection or with fear. What is perhaps most alarming are the divisions within the Christian church in America. Not that there has ever been a uniform vision of the church, but the enduring separations along race and increasingly sexual orientation is cause for serious challenge for faith leaders. So on the one hand, we've always seen challenges in terms of divisions, denominational differences, theological differences, cultural differences, racial differences, as it relates to the faith community, to the Christian church. But now, more than ever before, we're seeing those differences becoming more and more apparent and much, much more challenging to our way of thinking and way of being in the world. The politicalization of American evangelicalism has become of chief import even in this current presidential election. So we're seeing the role of the church and the evangelical community that is now immersed in this challenge of understanding our differences and how it can easily be politicized and used to advance certain political agendas and so forth. And so part of my concern as someone who believes passionately about the need to continue to lift up Dr. King's vision of the beloved community in the world house is that we have to be very careful that the church isn't drawn into the politicalization of faith, of the Christian message, of the Christian narrative. So in the words of Stanley Hauerwas and John Howard Yoder, the church does not engage in politics necessarily. The church is a politic that by learning how to love each other, learning how to forgive each other, learning how to create communities of justice and peace, we disrupt the cultural milieu of violence and tension and chaos that often dominates our current body politic in the world. So to go a step further, the challenge that we face today is that faithfulness to God and the God who revealed God's self in the slain body of Jesus Christ is of our highest, greatest allegiance, even beyond the state. And I know that's a challenge for some. I understand that that may be certainly something to wrap our heads around. But I believe that more than anything, our faith should take precedent over all of the allegiances that we have. And that the cause for loving our neighbor is the most important and urgent expression of our faith that we can offer to the world. And in doing so, we offer a gift to the world that by having the prophetic courage to love your neighbor as you love yourself, regardless of their race or ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation or socioeconomic background, is one of the courageous expressions of Dr. King's vision of the World House and the beloved community. You know, perhaps the most divided hour in our faith communities occurs on Sunday morning between the hours and 11 and 12 o'clock. Why is that the case? I think it's still certainly a challenge for many of us. I appreciate the efforts in the United Methodist Church communities, in the UCC communities, and other faith communities that have attempted to create spaces of reconciliation and shared faith. But in the town that I pastor in Bunn, North Carolina, right outside of Raleigh, the city capital of the state of North Carolina, there's still a challenge with churches divided. Churches worshiping in different spaces in different ways. And it's certainly not a problem that people have differences, but we ought to be able to come together, especially for the cause of justice and peace and love and compassion in the world. Whereas the church and faith leaders are called to bear witness to the work of justice and reconciliation, it has become a follower in terms of political discourse as the primary space for setting the cultural agenda for our country. So while many of these conversations should be happening in the context of the church and the faith community, we should be talking about justice. We should be talking about reconciliation. We should be talking about how to celebrate our differences, in the words of Desmond Mpelo Tutu. Now, I like the words that Desmond Mpelo Tutu uses when he talks about Ubuntu. So his concept of Ubuntu essentially suggests that I am because we are, that we are human because of our capacity to be in a relationship with others. Now, isn't that an awesome thought, friends? I mean, isn't that kind of compelling? The idea that what makes us human is our ability to be in a relationship with others, that what makes us human is not merely our individual rational capacities or our individual ability to exercise our moral agency, but what makes us human as well, according to Tutu, and of course Dr. King as well, is that we have the ability to be in relationship with others. Dr. King once used a quote from John Donne, who said, "No man or woman is an island entire of themselves, but every man or woman is a part of the main." And so the bell tolls for thee. In other words, that we are all invited to and beckoned and encouraged to be a part of the struggle to uplift humanity at its best. The gridlock we're seeing in Washington, D.C. is oftentimes but a reflection of the profound racial and economic and theological differences that we're experiencing in the faith community. The recent challenges that we're seeing on the Supreme Court are happening in our local communities as it relates to violence, whether it's gang and drug-related violence in Chicago, or whether it has to do with the mass shootings that took place in Las Vegas and other places across the country, is all connected to our ability or inability to struggle with our differences and, of course, come together as a community to work towards communities of justice and peace. You know, part of the challenge, I would argue, is overcoming the legacy of the modern preoccupation with categories and distinctions as the chief means for understanding the world. Hegel wrote a book many years ago entitled The Philosophy of History. Some of you are familiar with that text. And then, of course, Rene Descartes wrote a book called Meditations. These are both classics and examples that have celebrated the way in which descriptive categories mark a way of looking at the world, of understanding the world.
of defining the world. So categories around gender, race, ethnicity, religions, and cultures were born out of a vision of the world that could be best understood by attempting to understand these concepts in concrete and enduring ways. Now, I'm not suggesting that we don't try to define concepts and symbols and words and continue the task of critical thinking and logic, and of course, understanding the role of science and modern technology in helping us to do those things. What I am suggesting is that Dr. King's vision of the world house and the beloved community helps us to hold these categories with care and with concern, with the recognition that even in the midst of our categories, that we share a common humanity through it all, that we share more in common than we do our differences. And that by sharing our stories, our narratives, our journey through life and our experiences in the world is a way of connecting with our neighbors, regardless of our background. So one of the gems that I'm offering tonight is that in the task of doing the work of justice and reconciliation and connecting with those who are different is having the courage to share our stories, regardless of how uncomfortable it may seem, regardless of how much it may challenge us at our very core, but having the ability to share our story as a point of departure with someone who is different from us. It could be the janitor. It could be somebody who's walking along the street who's different. It could be someone even in our very homes, in our own families. But having the ability to share our stories, not to sort of superimpose our view of the world on someone else, not to sort of offer this grand narrative of the world, but to begin with the courageous expression of our own stories as one way of beginning the conversation. As we have learned from great philosophers, of course, like Michel Foucault, the moment we attach meanings to categories and concepts, for instance, when we talk about what it means to be Black, or what it means to be white, what it means to be Asian or Latino or Hispanic, or what those categories as it relates to different religions, that the moment we introduce those categories in hard, concrete ways, the moment that we attach power to those categories as well. And the way that we attach power is by the ability to advance our definitions of those concepts in the world. So the categories we use ought to be held with care and with fluidity. I'm going to make that point very clear. This is what I'm trying to say, friends, is that the categories we use should be held with care and, of course, with fluidity as well. Fluidity meaning that they are always changing. Symbols, words, concepts are always evolving, always changing, always sort of rapidly being reimagined in different ways. And so when we try to introduce categories in concrete, stiff ways, then we leave very little room for growth, for development, for change, for possibility as well. Furthermore, because of the dramatic rise of technologies and cyber communication and social media and global travel, the world, particularly the Western world, is becoming more and more aware of the dramatic differences and ever-changing forms of diversity, and of course, differences as well. The curious maze of differences invites anxiety sometimes, fear, consternation by many in an attempt to understand and stabilize the narratives of the world. So what's often creating, I think, a lot of the tension in our local communities, especially as it relates to race or the LGBTQ community, or as it relates to even people of different socioeconomic backgrounds, has a lot to do with all of the rapid changes that's happening in our world today, whether it has to do with technology, cyber communication, global travel, and of course, all of these other technological advances as well with social media. This year marks the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I think it gives us a great opportunity to think again about where we are. the last book of the last chapter that Dr. King wrote was Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And in that last chapter, which is sort of like his epitaph, is sort of like his last grand story and message, he talks about this vision of the World House. I don't think Dr. King had the opportunity to fully develop his ideas about the World House. He was slain, of course, on the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel on April 4th, 1968, by an assassin's bullet. So he was cut down too early to fully develop his vision of the World House. But I think, friends, that Dr. King was on to something. I think before social media was introduced, before the iPhone, before mass communication, before transcontinental travel as we know it today was introduced, I think Dr. King knew and saw on the horizon a world where we would be more and more connected and interconnected like never before. And so he recognized that we live in a world house, he said, a great house that is filled with people of different backgrounds and cultures. And he said, either we will learn how to live together as brothers and sisters or perish as fools. Well, as the father of an amazing daughter, 19 years old, who's a sophomore student at the University of South Carolina, has a father of a son who's graduating high school, I don't want to perish as fools. I don't want my children to live in a world where they are subject to that kind of chaos. And I know for many of you who are on the call tonight, who have grandchildren, perhaps great-grandchildren, you have friends and family, you don't want them to inherit a world of chaos and pain, sorrow, and drama and trauma. You want them to inherit a world of peace and love and compassion for all of God's children. And I believe that God is calling us, you and I, friends, as long as there is breath in our bodies, to work to advance the cause of peace and justice and compassion in the world. So finally, as I conclude, and I'm looking forward to the conversations in the small groups too, because I want to hear your stories. I want to hear your experiences and your perspective on what's happening today. I really want to hear what you are going through and what you have to say about how we can advance communities of justice and reconciliation today. The World House, finally, is a way of imagining a future that connects local and global realities. That's one of the things that Dr. King recognized when he wrote his last chapter of his last book, Where Do We Go From Here, is that somehow we cannot escape, friends, the fact that we are connected, that local communities are connected to global spaces, that for whatever reason, we are all interconnected. That's why Dr. King would say in his letter from Birmingham jail, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, that we're all somehow connected in some creative way. We're all tied into a single garment of destiny that whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I don't know how it's the case, but the fact is that what happens in our local community is connected to what's happening in Uganda, what's happening in the Congo, what's happening, of course, in the Sudan, what's happening in Palestine and Israel, what's happening in the Ukraine as well. So I think one of the challenges, one of the opportunities that we have as faith leaders, as those of us who care deeply about these issues, is to have conversations in our local communities, in our faith communities, at the coffee shops, at the beauty salons, at the barbershops, maybe even at the parks, the local parks, for those of you who like to go to parks, is to begin to have a conversation about how we are connected to what's happening in the global world. I think that's powerful. Like, I think if we just did that, friends, on this call tonight, that if each and every one of us had the courage to go to a local Starbucks or to go to a local park and to begin to have a conversation about how our lives in these local communities are connected to what's happening globally. Dr. King made a good point. I remember reading it when I was a seminarian at Duke Divinity School many years ago, where he was talking about how before we leave our houses in the morning, we are already indebted to half of the world. Well, what do you mean by that? Hill, what are you saying? Well, Dr. King, what he said is that when you look at where your shirt was made in Taiwan, maybe the soap that we use was made in, of course, in China. Maybe the cereal that we're eating was developed in Mexico. So by the time we leave our houses in the morning, we are already indebted to half the world because of the nature of the global economy. So because of the nature of the global economy alone, we are already interconnected like never before. The World House becomes ultimately, friends, a metaphor, becomes a concept, language that points us to the future of a world where we won't be looking at, of course, our distance and our differences, but we will recognize our shared humanity, that we are connected in this great grand cosmos, in this universe, that somehow we all are on a journey of wholeness, of fulfillment, of hope, of peace, of love and compassion in this so very troubled world. The World House ultimately is a way of looking ahead to the future. And not that there aren't challenges. I don't want to suggest that we live in a utopian world and we just sort of, get caught up in the emotion and the moment. It's hard work. The work of justice and peace is not easy. It requires determination, persistence, compassion, and of course, hope. But I like what Hebrews chapter 11 says. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. So I believe that in the substance of things hoped for, this concept of the World House gives us a way of imagining what the future looks like. And I leave you with these 3 points. First, building the World House and communities of justice and reconciliation means engaging in a passionate and thoughtful educational program that introduces students of all ages to the urgent reality of differences in the world. I believe every school, every community should be introducing the importance of celebrating our differences as human beings in a way that brings us toward a closer understanding of peace and justice in the world. We need curriculums in our school. We need curriculums in Sunday school, in our churches, in our faith communities that deals with the importance of reconciliation, of justice, and of course, celebrating our differences. Children and adults of all ages need exposure and information about the histories, stories, narratives, and cultures and languages of human beings all around the world. Human beings who contribute greatly to the betterment of human life on earth. In other words, we share a common humanity. And the more we learn other languages, we understand other walks of life, the more we're able to help advance the cause of peace and justice in the world. Secondly, we must work hard to end the material condition of poverty in the world as it relates to, and all of the other related challenges concerning mass incarceration, advancing a living wage, immigration reform, and of course, working towards access to healthcare as well. So we have to deal with the growing wealth gap in our nation and in our world. I'm not suggesting that somehow redistribution of wealth is the answer. Dr. King made a great point in this last chapter of the last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, that we could end literally the problem of poverty in the world if the rich would simply get richer at a slower pace. It's this urgent need to continue to amass wealth at a faster pace that contributes to the growing wealth gap more than ever before. So we have to deal with the problem of the gaps related to wealth in the nation. And finally, friends, we must forge communities of justice and reconciliation by forming bonds of friendship mutual respect, and dignity through our shared stories, mercy, and also through compassion for others around us like never before. Ultimately, the crucial question before the church and wider society is, what does it mean to be a global citizen? Sharing this planet together, friends, and to be faithful to the God of love and justice who demonstrates God's love in concrete and sacrificial ways. For instance, the ushering of a new global society is upon us, a world of fluid consciousness where the production of knowledge and ideas is a function of shared, interrelated, active, conscious, creative, and sustained love and compassion with all. So let us, friends, begin the work of building the World House together in our homes, in our communities, schools, churches, and of course, in our own hearts like never before. Let's start building the World House, shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand, eye to eye, and heart to heart. Thank you.
Dr. Hill, thank you. That was inspiring. I really appreciate the words of hope and possibility. Now, everybody, we'd like to give you a chance to talk with each other. We're going to break into small groups for 10 minutes, and we have posted a couple of questions in the chat so that you can talk together about tonight's presentation. So may I suggest that you introduce yourself and then jump right into the questions. Pick one that particularly appeals to you. And as soon as I stop talking, Leela's going to send you an invitation to join a breakout room. Please join in, share some wisdom. We'll reconvene in 10 minutes, and then we'll have some question and answer time with Dr. Hill. Get started with the Q&A, if that's okay with you. And, you know, one thought that I had almost from the time that you started, Dr. Hill, was given your work with educating students, what kinds of questions related to our topic tonight, what kinds of questions are young people in a college or grad school setting asking about faith and justice in your experience?
That's a really great question. The interesting thing is that young people nowadays have a very different view of racial differences, and of course, not just racial differences, but differences as it relates to gender, sexual orientation, to languages and ethnicity. This is a generation that was introduced or born into a world of technological differences, born into a world of technological advances. I mean, this was a generation that by the time you know, they were 2 or 3 years old, the iPhone had already been invented. So the iPhone, the BlackBerry, but particularly the iPhone and other digital devices came into our world and into our being at around the same time that social media was born. So with social media, you have the ability for individuals to share their stories, their images, their videos from different walks of life and all around the world. So on the one hand, I'm learning as much as I am trying to share with them about the meaning of differences. Now, on the one hand, there are students who really are not aware of some of these challenges. They have grew up in rural spaces or even in urban centers where they are not always aware of the things that are really actually impacting their lives. They feel it. They feel those differences, especially first generation college students who go into college and they're not aware of the inequities as it relates to economics or even our LGBTQ communities. They struggle with having acceptance and being embraced in traditional mainline churches and faith communities. And so they're looking to social media, to the internet, to discover meaning and understandings of the world. And here's the point, Jack. I'm not sure that the younger generation is looking to our historic churches and faith communities for understanding who God is and what God is doing in the world, or even about spirituality. I think they're looking to social media and to videos and to bits of information that's coming to them through cyberspace. And so according to Pew studies, many young people between 18 and 29 would rather consider themselves spiritual than to be considered religious, because the concept of religion, and that has to do, of course, in their minds with traditional mainline faith communities, carries a negative connotation, because in their minds it tends to be very judgmental, very alienating, and put off. And so I think on the one hand, they're not often aware that the importance of these historic communities, mainline churches, mainline denominations, etc., is that they have come through the fire, that many of the ideas and the theologies and concepts in these faith communities have withstood the test of time. They have withstood the test of scrutiny and theological debate and conversation over generations. And so there are questions that have been anticipated by various faith communities that they have not come to confront yet. And so on the one hand, we need these historic institutions and communities of faith to help deepen our understanding of theology and God and the church and faith, etc. And on the other hand, we're learning from this younger generation that they are open to the sea of information that's coming to them from social media, but they just need they need a navigator. They need navigation in this sea of information, and they need anchors. They need anchors and they need navigation, and that's sort of what I'm learning from that, Jack.
Yeah, and if I can follow up with another question on the same topic. So it seems to me that one of the assets of the faith community that gathers is a vocabulary. I was thinking to myself, there's almost no other place in the world that I go where I hear the word mercy, where I hear the word mercy or forgiveness. You don't bump into forgiveness at Starbucks.
No.
Isn't one of the challenges where are young people to encounter a vocabulary that seems precious? You talked about, the power of words or the power of categories, the power of a word like forgiveness, unless one bumps into it often, and it maybe even schooled in the art of forgiveness. How does one do that? And then my question to you is, how do we reach the young people that you speak of that have disconnected, that are now feeling disconnected from, if you will, conventional historic church?
What a wonderful observation, Jack. Years ago, this was in the 1990s, when I was just beginning my journey as a student in Atlanta, Georgia, at Morehouse College, and then later on when I was introduced to the life and the thought of Desmond Mpelo Tutu, is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and categories like forgiveness and reconciliation. While they are rooted in the faith community and the Christian narrative and Christian church, they were gifts to the world and are gifts to the world. So concepts like forgiveness are not isolated and simply for the Christian community. I think that's very important, that concepts like forgiveness are a gift to the world. And in that sense, you don't have to be a Christian in order to appreciate the understanding and concept of forgiveness or mercy or compassion or justice. And so part of our task is to inject the power of these concepts into the public square. So instead of just talking about a draconian legalistic way of approaching debates or issues in local communities, whether it has to do with gentrification, as an example, right? So for instance, as it relates to gentrification and getting bogged down and mired in legal conversations, what does it mean to introduce concepts like forgiveness as it relates to debt, as it relates to how to relate to each other in meaningful ways in local communities? What does it mean to talk about gift? For God so loved the world that he gave God's only begotten son. What does it mean to talk about the idea of gift, and not just for and within the Christian community, but even in the public square? How do we talk about the power of giving and gift that goes well beyond just simply the Christian faith community? So I agree with you wholeheartedly that there's a place for these concepts, and also holding them loosely so that they continue to evolve and grow in their meaning and understanding for us.
Yeah, I like that. Um, Dr. Hill, we got a question here. John asks, can you give some examples of where the World House has taken root and where the local churches have been able in some ways to activate the concept and made it a living possibility for themselves?
Well, I really appreciate the work that Reverend Raphael Warnock is doing at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. At Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, as well as Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York, they are a church that's not just really for that local congregation, but they have opened up their church for communities around the world to come and learn about the World House and the beloved community. So there are sojourners, there are those who will travel and those who will visit other churches and communities, such as Ebenezer, and engage in acts of justice and work together hand in hand to do that important work. I mean, I'd like to say that it's happening even with Just Faith. So the gathering in this platform of people from all around the world who are learning and sharing and studying together in the work of social justice is very, very important as well. I like what Eboo Patel is doing as well. Eboo Patel, in his work with interfaith youth workers, is a classic example. So with Eboo Patel's interfaith youth workers, there are young people who come together from different religions, different races and ethnicities to engage in acts of justice and, of course, reconciliation. But they're particularly involved in social justice work, actions, as well as, of course, building projects and local communities working together to make a difference. These are young people that come together to make these things happen. I like what Bread for the World is doing with Next Gen Project. So Bread for the World is engaging young people, young adults, to learn how to be advocates for working together to help feed the people of the world. So I think those are some examples. I would also point, of course, to what we're seeing outside of this country with the Desmond Tutu Center in South Africa. So the Desmond Tutu Center in South Africa is bringing people together to work on racial trauma, to learn how to grapple with our memories, right? Because sometimes, you know, Jack, memories can be a very big challenge in overcoming some of our, you know, stereotypes, you know, feelings around race, ethnicity, and gender and sexual orientation. So learning how to deal with our memories is very important as well. At the end of the day, I think we have to have the creativity to introduce new, exciting ways to engage in this work of reconciliation and justice. And it begins with us. It begins with looking in the mirror and doing our part in that process. In our local churches, in my local church, we work very hard to help partner with local communities and with faith communities to do works of justice together. So we volunteer together with the soup kitchen and with needs that may arise in the local community as well.
Very good. Dr. Hill, you referred to the work of Stanley Hauerwas and John Howard Yoder, and thinking of the church as itself a kind of politic, a way of people relating to one another. What we also know that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was somebody who made put a lot of energy into addressing, if you will, the powers that be, the state, if you will, trying to make a case about what is in the country's best interest, which of course he's drawing from his own theological and religious background. Can you say more about that interplay between church and state in that regard?
Absolutely. So where I sort of sit, Jack, is I hover between sort of, you know, a Harold Wattsian and Yoder and a Dr. King. I believe that both Yoder, King, and Hauerwas, as well as Dr. King, were onto something very important and very special. So Dr. King, while he recognized that being a Christian is being in the world in a different way, that it means existing in a way that disrupts the powers and principalities and the systems of the world, that inevitably it puts you on a collision course with the systems of the world. And so by engaging in courageous acts of justice, and for Dr. King, he used the power of nonviolent resistance, right? So for him, nonviolent resistance or nonviolent passive resistance
was not just a Gandhian belief system, but it also was something that's rooted in the Christian narrative, in the life of Jesus Christ, who endured the sufferings, of course, of torture and even unto death on the cross. And so on the one hand, it is about being and existing in the world in a different way. But God calls us to speak to the powers and principalities of the world. And here is where I think Walter Wink helps us out. So Dr. King would probably lean more so toward the side of a Walter Wink, and also engage in advocacy. So as good citizens of the world, as good citizens of our state, of our nation, of our local community, we are called to engage in civic responsibility in a way that is consistent with our moral and our theological values as human beings. So my concern is that we don't get too wrapped up in these categories of liberal and conservative, of Republican and Democratic, but we focus as much as we possibly can on the principles and values that we hold dear, that's rooted in love and justice and peace, and let that inform how we engage in civic responsibility and advocacy in the world as well. Remember, Dr. King never fully sided with either Republicans or Democrats, but he spoke the truth to both parties and encouraged and called the nation to account for its sins and for its injustices, and to advance certain principles and certain causes. So the last project that he was working on, of course, was the Poor People's Campaign and the Bill of Rights for the Poor. For Dr. King, the Bill of Rights for the Poor and the Poor People's Campaign was not a partisan issue, it was a human issue. And by recognizing that it was a human concern, he was able to hopefully appeal to the sensibilities of people who are connected to a variety of different political affiliations and beliefs. And that's where I think our task is, and our greatest strength as Christians and as believers, to appeal to the highest ideals of what it means to be human, as made in the image of God.
Thank you. Dr. Hill, I'm going to close with, well, let me just see, I got just another message. Let me see what it looks like. Yeah, so would you like to comment on the work of Bishop Barber and the Poor People's Campaign as an example of sort of moving toward the World House?
Absolutely. And thank you for mentioning that. And for those who are on the call tonight, please continue to pray for Reverend Barber, the Poor People's Campaign of North Carolina, and of course, the Repairers of the Breach that he has been so passionately a part of for many years. I've had the privilege of walking with Reverend Barber. I've had the privilege of standing with him on platforms here in North Carolina. When I served as Dean of Shaw University Divinity School, our students, seminarians, were passionately connected and involved in the various movements for peace and justice in the state of North Carolina and across the nation. I appreciate what he is doing. And I think that his work is an example of a continuation of the beloved community and the World House, that by engaging in acts of justice and peace and reconciliation, that Dr. Barber continues to hold up the guidon and the flag of justice and peace and compassion in the world. But there's more work to do. It's not just enough to march. It's not just enough to protest. It's also important that we continue to work of educating our hearts and minds and spirits and learn how to worship together in a way that advances peace and justice in the world as well. So I celebrate the work that Reverend Barber is doing, of course, with the Poor People's Campaign and the Repairers of the Breach. There's still much more work to do.
And by way of closing, Dr. Hill, share a message from Mary M. She writes, thank you very much, Dr. Hill, for your articulate, concise, thoughtful, and excellent presentation. I will take to heart what you have shared and see what I can do to build the World House that Dr. King encouraged us with. So, Dr. Hill, I just want to thank you on behalf of the Just Faith community gathered here. I'd like to invite all of those who are here to kind of give Dr. Hill our usual silent clap that we can offer. And thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Hill. It's just been a pleasure.
Absolutely. And Jack, very quickly, again, thank you so much to the Just Faith community. If anyone would like to stay in touch with me, please continue to reach out
I can be reached at, of course, my Instagram page at Johnny B. Hill, as well as my Facebook page at Johnny B. Hill. Please put that in the chat box, Miss Leela. It's JOHNNYBHILL. Also available on LinkedIn at JOHNNYBHILL as well. You can also reach me with my email address at hilltop1942@gmail.com. That's hilltop1942@gmail.com. I feel so passionate about this work, and I would love to come and speak to your local community. If you would ever need someone to come out and share a message, I would love to come out and continue to share this conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Hey, everybody, near the end of Dr. Hill's talk, he mentioned 3 important steps. And number 1 step was to engage in an educational tool, speaking to justice and reconciliation. Well, I have something for you. Before most of us go to the communion table in our churches, we first confess that we have not loved God and or our neighbors with our whole heart. And in other words, before we can receive the gift of reconciliation with God and one another, we must first tell the truth about what we've done or left undone. However, the temptation is to try and skip right to the easy part, reconciliation, without first doing the hard and necessary work of truth-telling. And because there is no truth-telling, there can be no reconciliation. So, my friends, the Faith and Racial Healing Program that Just Faith offers helps participants tell the truth about our collective history of racism and violence, that we might seek restoration with God and with one another. In outlining the topics to be covered in our first program of our racial justice series, that was entitled Faith and Racial Equity, the staff at Just Faith Ministries, we realized pretty quickly that it's impossible to work toward racial healing without first acknowledging the truth of our history. So we put together the second program to explain the historical context behind the racial inequalities that we face today, whether in education, criminal justice system, the workforce, or even in church life. And though we decided to focus specifically on enslaved Africans and their descendants, this program will open participants' eyes to patterns of injustice that affect other minority groups across the country as well. Whether your group is all white or more diverse, and regardless of your group's members' theological or political perspective, this program creates a safe space for healthy dialogue through the opening retreat, the immersion experience, 8 sessions. Your group will emerge from the Faith and Racial Healing Program better equipped to work toward restoration, the World House, the beloved community. So, end of advertisement. See our website for more information. Leela has put the link in the chat if you'd like to learn more. And then finally, before our prayer, please join us for the next Acting for Justice event in March, featuring a presentation entitled Unity, Equality, and Ecology, What Can a Muskrat Do? By Tom Schneider, who reports in his bio that in researching his heritage, he went back far enough to see that we're all one. How's that? So watch for the invitation to register and then join us again next month. Again, thank you all for being with us tonight. I'll close with a very, very short reflection from Daniel Berrigan. Let us pray. And then there is the question of prayer, which consists for the most part of insisting that God do for us what we are unwilling to do for one another. So resolve. Let's do for one another what we would have God do for all. This is known as Christ-like activity. Amen. Thank you all for being here. Good night. We'll see you next month. Thank you, Dr. Quill.